Good evening everyone, my name is Dilwar Hussein. I'm a journalist, I'm the deputy editor of Muslim news website 5 Pillars. I blog for the Huffington Post and I'm a featured writer for Al Jazeera English. Good to meet you all.
Hi, my name is Ghias, al-Jundi, and I'm a freelance human rights consultant. I worked for mainstream human rights organization before, Amnesty International, International Human Rights Watch and all this, and now it's totally free, so I'm working freelance for them as well.
Okay, so thank you for everybody for coming. Sorry about the wait, it's kind of unavoidable. So this is our first event of the year. We're BROOKESfocus, and today we're going to be discussing ISIS.
The structure for tonight is pretty straightforward. Roughly we'll have 30 minutes for each of our guest speakers, which will be followed by question and answer sessions for the questions we have waiting to be answered.
So, over to you guys. Whoever wants to start.
Okay, yeah. I like standing everyone, so I'll just read this. I'll try not to put you all to sleep. Thanks again for inviting me today to speak about a subject which has dominated our TV screens and our newspapers for the last 6 months. And this subject is, who is ISIS? Well, ISIS is an acronym for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. This group has also other names: ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, more recently Islamic State or Caliphate, or most commonly known in the Arab world as Daesh. Now, I'm not going to sit here and deliver you a lecture where you can just do a quick Google search or a quick wiki search or just tune into BBC or Fox News and you get all the relevant information about who ISIS are. I'm here to give a bit of political and social context behind how this group came about, how it went underground, how it really emerged. I'm also going to touch upon the Western states and the Western media's depiction of this particular group. And lastly, a bit of geopolitical implications for the region. So let's start with the origins of ISIS. Well, it was born after the US-led invasion of 2003. Its first name was Jamaat al-Tawheed al-Jihad, which in English translates the Organization of Monotheism and Struggle. Its main objective was to fight the occupying forces, the US, the UK, and NATO, and so forth. And then in 2004, it merged with Al-Qaeda, and it became known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And there were numerous reasons behind why they merged with Al-Qaeda: financial reasons, for training, and for an international appeal for fighters from outside of Iraq to join this fight against occupying forces. By 2006, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or Islamic State of Iraq, whatever you want to call it, had taken over the Anbar province. And Anbar province is a predominantly Sunni province, and they implemented a very harsh, rigid, backward implementation of Sharia law. And the Sunnis of Anbar province didn't welcome this. They didn't warm to this implementation of Sharia. You have to appreciate that under Saddam, majority of Sunnis were secular, they were Baathists. And whilst we appreciate that sectarianism is at its worst in the region, under Saddam was a secular dictator. He killed as many Kurds as he killed Shias as he killed Sunnis. It's well documented that he killed members of his own family and his tribesmen. So whilst he was a brutal dictator, he oppressed and killed people from all backgrounds. But there was security under Saddam. It's hard to say, but there was security under Saddam. So, how did the Sunnis of Anbar province respond to this harsh implementation of Sharia that was enacted upon them by ISIS, by ISIS at that time? Well, they weren't happy. There were numerous Sunni tribal leaders that were executed, kidnapped, they were beheaded, public executions, and they did not accept this at all. Obviously, the US recognized this. Nouri al-Maliki, who was the Prime Minister at that time, he also acknowledged this, and he realized the Sunni insurgency had really gained momentum, and they had to counter this. So the US approached numerous Sunni tribal leaders of the Anbar province, and they said that, look, this is a thorn in your back garden, it's a thorn in our back garden, we want security in Iraq, we need you to fight these guys for us. So they armed the Sunni tribal leaders, they funded the Sunni tribal leaders, and this organization was known as the Sahawat. In English it means the Awakening Council. And they successfully fought Al-Qaeda, and they pushed them to the deserts of Mosul, and literally al-Qaeda went underground. And they didn't do this for no reason. There were some conditions to this. And these conditions were that the Sunnis were given some inclusion into the government, that the Sunnis would have an opportunity to join the security services and the army and the police force, which by now had been dominated by the Shia. And obviously you had the autonomous Kurds up in the northern part of Iraq. So these were the conditions that the Sunni tribal leaders had set out if they were going to fight al-Qaeda on behalf of the US and the Iraqi government. Were these promises met? These promises of political inclusion, power sharing, employment prospects, were all these promises met? Unfortunately, they weren't. They weren't. And this led to a feeling of discontentment, unhappiness, further sectarian rhetoric from both sides, and a feeling of being let down and actually betrayed. That we helped get rid of al-Qaeda. We helped bring security back into these provinces, yet we are still oppressed and marginalized and excluded from power. And this continued for a few years, and the sectarian violence worsened. Sunni versus Shia, Shia versus Sunni, we had Shia death squads, we had retaliatory attacks from Sunnis, and the situation was worsening. But it is an undeniable fact that when Nouri al-Maliki came into power, that the Sunnis were excluded, isolated, and oppressed. Because you have to appreciate, after the US invasion, there's a lot of score setting. Saddam committed many crimes. So when Nouri al-Maliki came into power and the Shias had the upper hand, there's a lot of score setting. You have to keep this in mind. In 2010, in the elections, Sunni political parties participated, and a vice president, a Sunni vice president called Tariq Hashimi, he was sworn in. Within a year, he was actually punished with death sentence in absentia, then he was exiled. His party members were arrested and imprisoned for an alleged military coup plot. And if I could describe Nouri al-Maliki's reign as prime minister for 6.5 years, it would be one of paranoia. You have to appreciate that Nouri al-Maliki was a Shia politician who spent 24 years in exile. Many of his tribesmen and family members were arrested, tortured, killed under Saddam. Again, there's an issue of score setting here. But whenever he thought of Sunnis, he thought Ba'athis, he thought al-Qaeda, he thought the old nightmare of Saddam, the shadows of Saddam. And his reign, to be honest, like many political analysts and authors have said, that his reign was one that emulated one of paranoia. So after Tariq Hashimi was exiled, we saw endless amount of Sunni politicians and tribal leaders arrested, imprisoned. At one point, Hannah Edward, who is a part of Iraq Human Rights Watch, said that by 2012 there were more than 3,000 Sunni men in Abu Ghraib. Without any charge or due process, these men were kept in prisons without any charge. And honestly, after all this was worsening, this led to the first Sunni uprisings around about 2012. In Hawija, Ramadi, Fallujah, all predominantly Sunni towns and cities, we began to see civil disobedience. But while all this is happening in Iraq in 2012, just over the border in Syria, the civil war in Syria had well entered its second year and had become fully sectarian. An uprising which initially began as a legitimate political uprising against another secular dictator, Bashar al-Assad, with the interference of external and regional players like Saudi and Iran and Turkey, the conflict very quickly became sectarian. And who took advantage of this? The Islamic State of Iraq, just over the border, who had remained in the deserts of Mosul for years. They played the long waiting game. And the ones that remained were the hardcore, battle-hardened militants that the US didn't actually manage to kill. So Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, yes, that bogeyman that everyone, it's on the newspapers and the television screens, he spent 5 years in Camp Bucca. Camp Bucca was a US prison, along with 8 other senior ISIS leaders. They all spent years in an American prison. He sent over a very small group of fighters over to Syria to join the Syrian uprising. And this was against the orders of Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was the supreme leader of Al-Qaeda, who took over after bin Laden. So he actually went against his senior, and he sent a group of fighters over to Syria. And how did the Syrian rebels receive these fighters from Iraq? Well, initially, they were quite warm to them. They were quite warm to them because it was just a case of the more we have on board, the better and more easy it would be to fight Bashar al-Assad. But the reality was far different to that. Mistakes that were committed, or crimes that were committed by the Islamic State of Iraq back in 2006, what they did in Anbar, they began to start doing the same thing in Syria. And that was that lands that were already under the control of Syrian rebels, whether it was the Free Syrian Army or other Syrian brigades, they started re-liberating these lands. These lands that were already under the control of Syrians, they started taking these lands and again started implementing a very harsh version of Sharia. And the reality was this. You're planning to implement Sharia on people who were starving, who were malnutrition, who had no food, who had no shelter or clothing, and you expect them to pay you jizya? You expect them to abide by Sharia law when they've been oppressed, they have no more houses? This was unacceptable. And very similar to Iraq, the people of Syria eventually rejected this. And in January 2013, we started seeing the first episode of Syrian rebel infighting, skirmishing between the Free Syrian Army and ISI, who is now, as soon as they entered Syria, they became ISIS. Yeah? As soon as they entered the Syrian scenes, they became ISIS. But the reality was this: the experienced, battle-hardened fighters within ISIS, and not to mention the foreign fighters from Chechnya, from Afghanistan, these very experienced fighters who had fought guerrilla warfare in their relative countries, they had now joined the ranks of ISIS, and they were making huge grounds in Syria, in Aleppo, in Idlib, they made al-Raqqa their capital in Syria. So now ISIS was fighting two wars in two fronts, or they were about to fight two wars in two fronts. And unlike any other Sunni resistance groups I'm going to mention in a bit, it was easier for them to move resources from one country to another, be it manpower, be it weapons, be it finances, or whatnot. Also, they had control over oil refineries in Syria, which brought them $2 million a day. So whilst all this is happening in Syria, the Sunni uprising in Iraq was well on its way. In the cities of Hawija, Ramadi, and Fallujah, there were everyday peaceful sittings. And the main objective of these protests were for the rights of the Sunnis to be met: economic, political, social. But in April 2013, an event took place, and many analysts have said that this was the turning point. In Hawija, in 2013, conservative estimates say that around 400 unarmed Sunni protesters were killed by the Iraqi army. And this is when things hit boiling point. And this is unexpected, like the unarmed protesters, they didn't expect for their own army to turn their guns on them, you know? And again, I'll refer back to Hannah Edward, who attended these protests and said that all the protesters that I witnessed were unarmed and had legitimate grievances. So once the massacre had taken place in Hawija, we saw another power vacuum, a re-emergence of this group that went underground for years. We saw ISIS enter the scenes again in Iraq. And basically what they told the tribal leaders was this: look, you tried the democratic process. You fought us in 2006 and 2007. And what did they promise you? None of your promises were met. The democratic process has failed you. Civil disobedience has failed you. Look at your son there, he's been killed in front of your own eyes. You need muscle, you need protection. How can you trust the Iraqi army, which is predominantly Shia? You need armed groups to protect you. And I'd also like to note that ISIS was not the only group. There were other armed Sunni groups, the Naqshbandi army, which was a Sufi resistance group, Sunni, and there were former Ba'athists, and there were other groups there. But unlike ISIS, all they were determined to do was to remove monarchy from power and to reinsert some Sunni influence back into Iraq. Whereas ISIS had other agendas, and that was to obviously carve up an Islamic state. Now, people are wondering, well, if it was a case that Sunni tribal leaders had already experienced ISI, Al-Qaeda or ISIS, whatever you want to call them, previously back in 2006 and 2007. Why would they lock arms with them now? It's quite hard to say this, but it was literally a case of ISIS was a lesser of two evils for the Sunni tribal leaders. It was either work with ISIS or work with the Shia-led government of Nouri al-Maliki, who had broken promises previously. And they've even said it in public interviews. They said, look, we're going to work with these guys, our objectives are different, but as soon as we remove Maliki, we're going to deal with these guys. They said this very public, they're very clear about it, but they said we would rather work with ISIS than work with the government of Nouri al-Maliki. And when we remove Nouri al-Maliki from power and we reinsert the Sunnis into some position within the government and the security services, the army and the police force, then we will deal with ISIS. ISIS is our problem, we will deal with them. But the reality was that ISIS, over the border in Syria, had manpower, had weapons, had an income of $2 million a day from oil refineries. And this is why they made far more advances than any of the other Sunni resistance groups. And obviously there was a sectarian nature to their advance. The other Sunni resistance group had no intention to blow up Shia shrines or to carry out summary executions of Iraqi soldiers. This was obviously carried out under ISIS. On the 6th of June, a monumental event took place, and this event caught the world's attention. And this was when between 800 to 1,000 ISIS fighters entered Mosul, the third biggest city in Iraq, a city which only a few years ago was under US occupation. And against 20 to 25,000 Iraqi soldiers, they'd managed to totally take over this city. We may be wondering, oh, well, how does that even make sense? How does 800 to 1,000 take on 20 to 25,000? Well, Dexter Filkins, the author, an American author of Forever War, he described the Iraqi army at that time as fat cats. These guys were very well paid, very comfortable in their position, and they did not perceive the Sunni population as worth protecting as their own. Again, we have to appreciate that Iraq currently has become a very sectarian country. Lots of old school settling. It's the unfortunate reality. And I have to keep on highlighting that under Saddam, this was not the reality. The reality of sectarianism peaked after the US-led invasion. So they entered Mosul. They took over banks that had millions upon millions of dollars. And not only that, there was US weapons stockpiles. So in Osama bin Laden's wildest dream did he ever think to himself that jihadists would get their hands on US Humvees and anti-aircraft missiles and be parading them on the streets of Mosul. This was unthinkable. This was a whole new chapter, a whole new era of the jihadist movement. This was unthinkable. And it is actually stated that many, if not majority of the Iraqi soldiers, if they weren't caught and then executed, they jumped out of their uniform, went into plain clothes and murdered the civilian population. 3 weeks later, another monumental event happened. On the 29th of June, which was actually the first day of the holy month of Ramadan for Muslims, ISIS declared the restoration of a caliphate. And the reason why I've chosen to talk about this very briefly is that when they made this announcement, at such a crucial time in the Islamic calendar, they had really caught the attention of the Muslim world. When you think of the caliphate, regardless of your political or theological or sectarian background as a Muslim, for those of you who may not be aware, whether you consider yourself to be the Hanafi, Maliki, Hanbali, Shafi'i, Sufi, Salafi, Deobandi, whatever background you feel that you come from, if you look back in history, it is well documented that a caliphate is well rooted in Islamic theology. The caliphate was the resummation of the prophethood. And we had the four rightly guided caliphs, we had the Umayyads, we had the Abbasids, we had the Ottomans. And when people think of the caliphate, when Muslims think about the caliphate, they think of a golden era, an Islamic golden era when Muslims led mankind and humanity in sciences and maths and philosophy and all facets of life. So it resonated amongst millions of Muslims that, whoa, you know, we've never had this call before. We had Mullah Omar in Taliban say that, you know, I'm the Emir of Afghanistan, but we've never had someone who's come out and said, this is a caliphate and I'm the caliph. But how did the Muslim world respond to this? Well, let's begin with the like-minded groups like ISIS. Al-Qaeda rejected this call. They rejected ISIS's claim to a caliphate. The Syrian rebels, many of whom also reside in Islamic State for Syria, if they were to topple Assad, they rejected this call. Groups like, non-violent groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, who has a presence in the UK, they rejected this call. The Muslim Brotherhood, the oldest and biggest Islamist movement in the Muslim world, they rejected this call. Al-Azhar University, the highest Islamic institution in the Muslim world, they rejected this call. The Saudi religious establishment, people who say that, you know, these guys are Wahhabis, so are ISIS, they rejected the call. So unequivocally and overwhelmingly, the Muslim world and Islamists of all types and nations, they rejected this claim of ISIS. But I'd like to note that they did not reject the concept of a caliphate, they rejected ISIS's claim to a caliphate. 5 days later, another audacious move by ISIS, that bogeyman called Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who spent 5 years in a US prison, he made a public appearance. And people are watching this and they think to themselves, oh, no, we've seriously moved on. We've seriously moved on from the days of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda are like old news. These guys are the new kids in the block. And he addressed a congregation in the great mosque in Mosul, and he basically told the whole world, the Muslim world, that I am your leader, come and join arms, fight jihad, and help this state. Again, this was unthinkable under the days of Bin Laden and Zawahiri. So what's the situation now? Where do we find ourselves now? Well, ISIS was making advances, and there were many crimes and human rights abuses that took place in amongst the religious and ethnic minorities that lived under the areas under their control, namely the Yazidis. And though the number is unconfirmed about how many were killed and how many were pushed to the mountains, some say 50,000, others say 5,000, others say 500. Regardless, the numbers are irrelevant. Religious minorities and ethnic minorities that did not subscribe to ISIS' way of thinking were killed, imprisoned, and in some cases forced to convert to Islam. However, whilst Western leaders, Obama, Holland, Cameron, whilst they, for 3 years, we heard endless rhetoric that we need to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, this brutal dictator. Now we're approaching the 4th year, and this man used chemical weapons against his own people. More than 200,000 Syrians are dead. 7 million outside of Syria. And there was not even fluttering an eyelid. Not even fluttering an eyelid from Western leaders. But when ISIS got close to the city of Erbil, you know, you've got a gentleman there, his name is Erbil. When ISIS approached the city of Erbil, and Erbil was a city which brings in $3 trillion a year. It's a city which has 4 big US energy companies there. So as soon as the US interests were directly threatened, that's when the airstrikes came. But there was a condition to these airstrikes. Obama said that Maliki has to resign. This man has caused too much damage. He represents too much problems for us to now carry out airstrikes. So he resigned, new prime minister, and the airstrikes began in Erbil. And personally, I saw this as the US basically drawing a red line. And I have my reasons for this, and you're welcome to ask this in the Q&A. And it's literally a case of, we're going to let you cause wreckage and destruction, but you cannot go there. And you cannot go there. And Erbil was one of those areas. Erbil was one of those no-go areas for ISIS. Hence we saw the airstrikes. And how did ISIS respond to these airstrikes? We saw the despicable and abhorrent execution and beheadings of 2 US journalists and 2 British aid workers. Abhorrent, disgusting, unarmed, non-combatants, who under Sharia law would be protected. These men were beheaded and executed. But again, I'd like to highlight this, that it's very sad that when James Foley, Stephen Sotloff, David Haynes, Alan Henning, so much media attention was given to them, rightfully so to a certain degree. But what about Dr. Abbas Khan, another UK citizen, who was killed in the prisons? And his mother and his brother said that all it would have taken was one phone call from the Foreign Office to get my son released, that he died in the dungeons of Bashar al-Assad. What about the 200,000 that have died in Syria over 3 years? What about the children of Ghouta who died from Syrian gas and the use of chemical weapons? No, we become desensitized to this because these individuals don't have names, they're not plastered all over our press and our TV screens, and it's very sad that it took the beheading and the execution of 2 journalists and 2 aid workers who actually went there to help the Muslims of Syria. It's very sad that it had to get to this until airstrikes were being carried out. I'd also like to know, for those of you who sneakily, I want everyone to secret safe with me, if you watch the beheading videos, they were quite violent. I had to for research purposes. There was no mention of religion. ISIS did not mention any hadith, sayings of the Prophet, or any verses in the Quran. They explicitly mentioned airstrikes. They explicitly mentioned foreign policy. France, Germany, Italy, Turkey had all negotiated the release of their citizens in the hostage negotiations. The US and the UK obviously have a non-negotiation policy with terrorists. Sadly, we saw what happened to those individuals. And now we are seeing a long, durable skirmish in the Syria-Turkey border of Kobani. And we're seeing a 40-nation-led coalition against ISIS. One would imagine that, this is the end of days. This is the end of days. That this is the biggest coalition since World War II. That 40 nations have gathered to bomb ISIS. And how are the people on the ground perceiving this? They're seeing it as, for 3.5, 4 years, our children have been dying. Yet, this militia, this terrorist organization, who have been doing what they've been doing right under your noses, right under your radar, and in fact, bombing them in Syria and Iraq is actually assisting Bashar al-Assad. So it's not really looking good for the West in terms of, their consistency in policy. But I'd like you all to think about a few things, and again, you can ask this in the Q&A. I want to raise 3 areas for you to all ponder on. The first is, why is it that whenever we've been hearing about ISIS or the Islamic State, and, in the news and the newspapers, why is it that there's not really any mentioning of their origins or their background, how they came about? Why is there not a mention of the fact that this organization came to birth as a result of the US-led invasion? A war which is actually legally, under international law, illegal. There were no WMDs found. The UK committed itself to a war based on false intelligence, and millions of people marched in Hyde Park. This was the result of how ISIS and groups like Al-Qaeda come into birth. When they see power vacuum and they see an opportunity to come in, foreign occupation works in their favor. This is ignored by the press. This is ignored by politicians and the press. Secondly, why is it the case that when Muslims have unequivocally, overwhelmingly rejected ISIS, that there's still an immense media pressure for Muslims to condemn, and not in my name, and this is not us, and why is there an immense pressure on Muslims to continue condemning something that wasn't necessarily done at all in the name of their religion? When the IRA was carrying out terrorist attacks 20 years ago, was every Roman Catholic expected to come out and apologize? No. So we need to appreciate, and I ask the Muslims and the non-Muslims in the audience to wonder and to think about this. Why is it that Muslims are being pressured to continuously condemn when we've already done this? For God's sake, Islamists, forget moderates and those who are secular and liberal in their thinking, the Islamists have rejected ISIS' claim. Why is there an immense pressure for us to reject this organization which is not carrying out these actions in our name? And thirdly, I want you to think about the double standards and the hypocrisy of Western governments. That Kurds were being killed under Saddam for years. There was no movement from the West, from Western powers. Syrians had been getting killed for 3 years. We had empty rhetoric from Washington and Downing Street. Why is it that when the Yazidis were being oppressed and pushed to the mountains, that there was only humanitarian help? But as soon as ISIS approached Erbil and the economic interest of the US was under threat, that's when the airstrikes come. Why is there a selective policy of pick and choose on what we deem, or what our governments and our leaders deem as humanitarian intervention, military intervention? There has to be a level of consistency in their policy. So I'll leave you all to ponder on that, and I'll pass it over to my respective guests.
Thanks, for you started to explain how the ISIS started. Even I have some points to later. I definitely, one word I always, first I'm so happy that I come here. I'm always excited to talk to students, and this is a great pleasure for me. I always emphasize on one thing, that Assad of Syria never ever been a secular dictator. He is a terrible dictator who used the Islamists through his history. Under Assad, 18,000 mosques built in Syria. Before Assad, Syria was a fantastically secular country where every sect lived peacefully with the other, till Assad came in 1970. So Assad used every single aspect of Islam to change the reality, and to be able to use the divide and rule.
Well, what did you actually, is this his father as well? Hafiz al-Assad?
Yes. I said since 70. Bashar took over in 2000, inherited his father, and so as Dilwar spoke about how the ISIS emerged, because I'm originally from Syria, so I will just speak briefly about how it expanded in Syria. In 2000, the ISIS never been created in, with respect to your views, never been created in 2003, after 2003 invasion of Iraq. The core, the seed of the ISIS, it is always in the region. It's always created by Saudi Arabia. If you go back to the Saudi Arabian curriculum, it's terrible ISIS. It's terrible ISIS. It is. I've been recently trying to read what they did with Saudi Arabia teach their children. It's what the ISIS doing. Exactly, the attack on Kafir, the infidels, all this stuff. Saudi Arabia arrest during my work at Amnesty. I worked on the research desk of Saudi Arabia. Exactly. And if they found a Christian South Korean, I worked on his case. He's a Christian. They raided his house and they found the Bible and they arrested him. 6 months I worked on his case. 6 months, and he was disappeared. No visits, incommunicado. No communication with the outside world. He had a high rank position in one of the petrol companies. They found a Bible. And in Islam, I'm not Muslim. In Islam, I know that the Islam don't disregard Christianity. Of course, in Syria we live together. My village is half Christian, half Muslims, of some people like me who don't belong to any belief. The Saudis created the seed in the region. Assad used it very well, in brackets, in his rule. The ISIS, let's go back to the ISIS. In 2003, George Bush invaded Iraq, and of course threatened to invade Syria. And Assad brought all these so-called jihadists, and then from Tunisia, from Libya, from other people, from other countries, Middle Eastern countries, and used them to go to Iraq and do some car bombs in Baghdad and other cities. This is very well documented. I worked and I'm friend with 5 bloggers who have been arrested in Syria in 2006. This is before the age of the Facebook. They started a website, very nice little website called Akhawiyya, which is Brotherhood, and just to discuss something called civil society, even the thing spreading Assad regime. the Assad regime is one of the most brutal secret services apparatus arrested these guys called Air Forces Secret Services. And these secret services mostly responsible for the killing of the activists during the revolution, or the events, if we can call it revolution. Now, the guys were detained in Syria military prison in the outskirts of Damascus with these Salafists. And the guys came, he detained them, sent them to Iraq, he used them, and lied to them as well. One event I can register, when the Danish cartoonist drew the Prophet Muhammad, he released them, and they burned the Danish embassy, Danish and Chilean, because it was in the same building. And they were, those people, they were the Islamics, the Tunisians, the Iraqis, and the Syrians, and all of this. I mean, during their imprisonment, he brought imams, specialized secret services imams, and manipulated them, brainwashed them inside the prison. And of course, he released them, did some car bombs in Iraq, made chaos for George Bush to be involved in the flight in Baghdad and leave Syria alone, the regime, I mean, alone. And this is well documented. We published that. The guys are all, these 5 people all scattered in, one in Tunisia, one in Beirut, one in Egypt and stuff, and they spoke about their cases. In 2008, the regime kept lying to them. In 2008, they rebelled against the regime in prison. So they started banging their doors, and the regime killed around 280 people. This is the number I remember inside the prison, live bullets. So the ISIS didn't actually start somewhere else in Syria. But of course, after the 15th of March 2011, the event started in Syria. The regime spoke from day one that the events in Syria, we are fighting terrorists. So he wanted to present to the West, these are not the Syrian people who are really seeking justice, fairness, blah, 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 stop torture and all this. These are the terrorists. Fortunately, the Syrian people who rebelled against the regime, they carried on with a fantastic peaceful protest and revolution and demonstrations all over Syria. And it was mixed, lots of Christian, lots of Ismaili, lots of Alawite, lots of non-believers joined the revolution. The most decisive disaster within this context during the peaceful period, there was something called sit-in of a Sa'a, a clock in Homs city, where people sat next to it. It's like Madame Tabril. People sat there, and it was full of everybody. Women, unveiled, veiled, children, men, Christian, communists, everybody was there. And that was a terrifying moment for the regime. He sent the tanks. Sorry to say, the tanks walked on people, drove on people. That was a terrible, and this is a turning point of this revolution. People started carrying arms. The first arms were delivered at Homs by the Syrian army. He delivered the arms to the fighters, to the FSA, which was very new that time. I think it's August or September 2011. He gave them the arms and said, please fight me, because, of course, I want to say to the West, I'm fighting terrorists. I'm with you in the same, it's called trench, or on the same front. Exactly what the Syrian regime's newspapers wrote when the West coalition started bombing the ISIS. On the front page of the last newspaper, I don't know who is here from Syria or in Arabic, on the front page of the last, Tishrin Assads, all the media in Syria, all on the regime, wrote, Syrian Arab army are in the same trench with the coalition. This is in August 2014. These are the Syrians, it's how the ISIS really started attracting people inside the Syrian community and then the foreigners. Of course, the regime from day one directed or drifted the events in Syria to be sectarian. It wasn't sectarian, it is still not sectarian till this moment, not fully sectarian. It is sectarian, but it's not fully sectarian. In Syria, we reached a stage everybody wants to kill everybody or everybody wants to escape. Black and white. There is no middle way. This is the ISIS. Look, the ISIS in Iraq, it was called the IS first. Yeah, yeah. It started looking into that context and said, oh, it's our name. What did the Syrian regime? The Syrian regime evacuated the city of Iraq without any single bullet, because it's the borderline of Iraq. He withdrew from the Iraq city, without any fighting, and then had three units, big divisions around Iraq. Division 17 and Atabqa military airport, which like recently was captured by the ISIS just like last month, and they killed all the soldiers. They executed them immediately. So the regime was aware of what it was doing, the vacuum, and presenting what's happening to the West now, either me or the ISIS or Al-Qaeda. This is the ISIS exactly well planned, well managed by the Syrian regime. He played a card where the West is very weak, very fragile when it comes to these kind of things. It's September 11 or whatever. So he played this vacuum at this card, and of course, I don't want to deny the injustice and on the Sunni community, but Syria is, I mean, the Sunni community, big part of Syrian Sunni community are supporting the regime still. Most of the Walid al-Muallim, the all Sunnis, the Mufti, but the majority of the Sunni, of course, against the regime. But I'm not Sunni and I'm against the regime. My family against the regime. All my Alawite friends are against the regime. So this is the plan, absolute plan of Assad regime, and of course behind him the Iranians and the Russians. On the other side, Syria became an arena of fighting, of revenge between different international bodies or sides. I mean, we have the Iran, the regime, and Russia from here, and then we have Qatar and Saudi Arabia from the other side. I mean, disaster, this is personal views. The main disaster in the Syrian revolution is Qatar. Qatar did play a horrible, terrible role. From the first 2 months of the revolution, Qatar brought their right hand, it's called the Muslim Brotherhood, to share power with Assad. So that if you are Syrians, I don't know Syrian, you can follow the Arabic Al Jazeera, and there was no mention of the revolution. 2 months between 15th March to the 15th May, Al Jazeera didn't do anything, except they brought the Muslim Brotherhood from exile and had 2 meetings, very crucial meetings. One in the Doha and one in Istanbul, under the sponsorship of Mr. Erdogan. Assad agreed in both meetings that he would share power with Muslim Brotherhood. Sorry, I have to drink just for my message just to cover. And then he said no, because he knew any piece of the bread he gives is finished. So he completely broke his promise as usual, and the Al Jazeera turned against the regime. I tell you some incident I was following. I work most of my work, 90% of my work is on the freedom of media in the Middle East. And I was monitoring Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, of course, which belongs to the Saudis. And the reports they were mentioning, it's a disaster. It is a proper disaster. It's not, Al Jazeera played a role, it is not a media outlet anymore. It's some political agency started doing it's exactly what the Free Europe radio did during the Soviet era, where they broadcasted from Austria to address the people of East Europe. This is Al Jazeera. I appeared on Al Jazeera 3 times, Al Jazeera Arabic, just because I wanted to attract this society in Syria and speak about human rights, blah, blah, blah. So the third time I did appear on Al Jazeera, I went and spoke, and I said to the presenter, there are external players getting into the events. And they said, who? Them. And I said, Qatar. Live. In the second, the screen went shh. And then went back. Of course, I was cut off. And the presenter was saying, Mr. al-Jundi, Mr. al-Jundi. Unfortunately, we had a line break from with the office, with our offices in London. And I was laughing. The floor director was Australian, didn't speak any Arabic. He laughed, looked at me and said to me, did you mention Qatar? And I said, exactly. Never called me after. Never ever called me. And Qatar started supporting al-Nusra Front and is openly supporting al-Nusra Front. If you remember when they kidnapped the nuns in Malula next to Damascus.
Qatar was the mediator.
Qatar mediator. Now, the moment as I speak, Qatar is mediating with al-Nusra Front to release us Lebanese soldiers in our cell. Now, and it's openly, and this is one of the most annoying, if I want to be polite, aspect with the Americans. Qatar is supporting all these terrorists, and still Qatar is the most important ally for the USA. The biggest military base, trade, everything. Qatar is a little baby in the West. So this is what Syria is now. I mean, so many players playing that, bad players, fighting the Shia, the Sunni, hidden war between Saudi Arabia, the Sunni Wahhabi Saudi Arabia, and the Iranian Shia. I was telling you before the event, yesterday I don't watch any TV actually. I was watching some clips posted on Facebook where in the heart of Damascus there is a big celebration of Ashura, which is the Sunni, the Shia celebration of the killing of Hussein. And this is very new. I lived all my life in Syria, 16 years here, the rest in Syria. We never knew that. There is something called Sayyidah Zainab in Damascus, where the Shia come and have a pilgrimage. But there is no this open celebration in North Damascus, and it's planned. It's a show. The regime saying, with the Iran said, we own Damascus. Of course, that will inflame the anger of the Sunni community as well. Not the normal Sunni community like my family or people, but they at least a politicized Sunni community or Sunni fighters. Well planned, I don't know well what, but it is a war, a foreign war on the Syrian land, and the civilians are the victims. I wanted to mention something as well. I told you maybe before. In the beginning of the emerge of al-Nusra Front or the ISIS later, many of the Arab fighters, so-called jihadists, went to Damascus airport. And we have the group of civilians, civil society advocates like me, we documented that. We documented that they went to Damascus airport even after the regime banned, abolished the Arab. Before the revolution, Arabs were able to enter Syria without visa. Any Arab with full rights, if there were any rights. After 15th of March, they abolished that. There was no more possibility. The Tunisians, the Libyans, the Algerian fighters went to Damascus airport. Why? Somebody with a beard, no mustache, clear cut club, a Tunisian coming to Syria and Summer 13. Why? Why? A friend of mine, Algerian journalist, he worked for the Algerian government newspaper, one of them. He was detained in Damascus airport for 4 days. Never let him leave, never let him come in. Till the regime said, oh, he's a good boy, but send him back to Damascus, the Algerian regime. So why that Tunisian fighter would come to Damascus mean, this is the game the regime played, and he succeeded, unfortunately. So I'm fighting the terrorists, I'm fighting Al-Qaeda, and I'm secular. And so many people still believe it's secular. And I witnessed while I was living in Damascus, I witnessed the opening of so many Quran learning schools, which I do not mind in general when somebody wants to go to an institution to teach Quran. But the schools the regime was opening, it wasn't a normal school. It was completely a regime-oriented school where he can train people, manipulate them, and later he can use them, which what he did in Iraq earlier during the crisis. So this is, sorry, the introduction is a bit long, but it's kind of triggered by my colleagues. I forgot to mention Turkey, because this is very important. Turkey played a disastrous role, and now it's emerging to the Western intelligence. Most of the second stage fighters came by Turkey. All of them came. We have some activists in Antakya, Antalya, and they were like plane spotting. Plane coming from Jeddah in Saudi Arabia to Antalya. Back with men. Exactly. They knew about it. They could have arrested them easily. Last month I came back, 2 months ago, I came back from Istanbul, and the British government interrogated me. They know who I am, they know what is my connection, but just because I went to Turkey, what do we doing there? Politely. But the Turkish, they know the fighters coming from Tunisia, from Benghazi, from all of that. They know. And Erdogan position on Kobani now, it's very clear what he is doing, and Turkey is confirmed buying oil, cheap oil from the ISIS. Clearly. I mean, the Turkish are in a very critical, on the edge of morality, clearly. What I want to say, the second thing I want to say is the damage ISIS goes to the Syrian revolution, or to the Syrian people demands, right demands. The ISIS drifted the attention from people who are dying under torture inside Assad's prisons to people who want to fight ISIS because of this. Not our culture, not our heritage, and as Dilwar said, the Sunni community in Syria became under terrible scrutiny. They just wanted to prove, no, we don't support them. We don't support them. And this was a disaster. The guys who organized the most beautiful, peaceful demonstrations found themselves fighting on the phone. In Idlib, in Aleppo, in Raqqa, and instead of fighting the Assad regime and finishing it off, they started fighting the ISIS. I don't know if you followed the Geneva so-called negotiation between the regime and the coalition, Syrian coalition. Yeah, and one of the journalists who I worked closely with, from Iraq, he ran after the Syrian regime foreign minister of information. This is in Syria, the secret services of media. So any media acts or operates, or any journalist, the minister of information deals with it. He ran after him and he said with a microphone, he ran and said, I can send you the video. Fantastic, it's translated here. He said, who is fighting the ISIS? Minister. And the minister of information, who is from Daraa, where the Syrian revolution started, didn't answer. He said, tell me, who is on the world now fighting the ISIS? Who kicked them from Idlib? And of course he didn't answer. But the answer was the Syrians. The FSA, Green Syrian Army, started fighting the ISIS in Idlib, and they kicked them out completely. Kicked them out, cleared the whole area. And they went to Aleppo, then they were kicked out of Aleppo, then they had some suburbs of Aleppo, Al-Bab and Azaz, and other cities are now collapsing. They haven't, thank God, they haven't got it, but they are fighting. So the damage became so deep as well, and the other peaceful activists or people who didn't carry arms or have nothing to use arms found themselves in a very difficult situation. They get involved in the play, the game the regime played. So somebody like my cousin would call me and said, no, when it comes to Assad, a bad secular dictator, a bad dictator better than the ISIS beheaded me because I'm not Sunni Muslim. And I had to spend 1.5 hours with my cousin saying, no, this is a lie. This is a lie. If you just speak a word, the regime will behead you. Look, Abbas Khan is a doctor from England. He was killed. The regime has no friends. The people became, the Syrian situation became so, or too emotional. The rationality is absent from most people. I mean, I tell you, my family lives in a city called Brookes, which has no fighting so far, but they can't do anything. They can't do anything. I mean, the Syrian mercenaries, it's called Shabiha. My mom had a satellite dish the other day. She moved to a new house. Half an hour, somebody came up, cut it off, broke it, and put it on the doorstep. And they are terrorizing people. But my family, they understand, literally. But the other people who wanted to change the regime ages ago, they started saying, oh, we are scared of the ISIS. So the ISIS created a platform for the regime to gain more support. Syrian revolution started on ending the corruption of the Assad family, now ending the ISIS. Ending the torture in prison, now ending the beheading. Protecting women, now women are raped, sold. The Yazidis sold. And they say Prophet Muhammad, say peace upon him, said that. I mean, they are using Islam. So instead of somebody like me fighting for Syrian women's rights, the right to divorce, the right to marry, the right, now people are fighting for the woman to be protected from being sold by the ISIS. So the ISIS and its sisters really changed what we all as Syrians believe in. And I mean, I've been 16 years in exile because of this fighting for that cause. And I've been back to Syria, and thousands or 10,000 were like me before the revolution, not millions. You said 7 million, and I say 8. And there are 4 million inside, in displaced people. So the emerge of the ISIS and Nusra Front, they were the end of our dreams. However, I want to say something really positive. I was telling you, in the areas where the ISIS were kicked in Idlib, we have fantastic things happening, really. There's cultural centers, painting, drawing workshops, poetry events, but as Dilwar said, none of the Western media is interested. I've been fighting hard for some journalists to go and see the cultural centers in Idlib, in Sarakib, where people use the walls the regime destroyed. It's like the Berlin Wall. We run exhibition in Amsterdam, London, Paris, Munich about these paintings did in Chernobyl, in Idlib, in Sarakib, and I definitely believe that the ISIS is a passing cloud, a terrible cloud, but I think Syrians never been in such a dilemma, and they will never accept the injustice imposed by both terrorizing sides. And I say terrorizing sides, I really strongly believe that Assad is on the same step of ISIS. They both are awful terrorists, and except Assad is a legitimate terrorist who killed in 2013, we have 11,000 documented deaths in custody. 11. Now, in October, in Damascus Secret Services branches, we documented 92 people dead, killed, and tortured. The victims of the regime were from everywhere. We have a political leader who is an Alawite called Abdulaziz al-Khair. You heard of him. He is a great person and he's from the same village of Assad. Spent 12 years in prison, 12 years in hiding in Syria, and he's disappeared now, and he's Alawite. Yesterday we had 3 human rights activists, including a woman called Maria Shabo, who she was born in prison. She was born in prison. Her mom was arrested in 1987 for belonging to the Communist Action Party, and she was pregnant. And she was born in prison, and they kept the baby with her mother for 18 months before they released her to her grandfather. Yesterday she was arrested, and she is half Alawite, half Christian. Her mom is a Christian, her father is Alawite. The regime is targeting everybody, and there is a myth in Syria, in the West, that Assad is protecting minorities. One thing I would like to state, my family came from a little Islamic sect called Ismaili. Ismaili never been having problem in history till Assad came. The Christians lived thousands of years in Syria. They go to our weddings, they go to our funerals. One of them get married, we all there. Once somebody dies, we do the ceremonies. They live together. In Syria, the only people who Christian church and religious men, Christian religious men killed by the regime. The first killing was in Hamas Street when one of the churches opened the door for the people who were escaping from that bomb. The next day, the priest was shot dead. Syria has never been a safe haven for extremists, except the regime. The regime, he is an extremist, and there is a myth. Assad is creating all this chaos to survive. Practically, Assad is controlling now 4 kilometers in Damascus and Tartus, ICP. And we don't know where we are going. It's a very painful era in Syrian history, but I do believe the end of this life is coming, and that we need years to live. My speech is not that practical. No. Some emotions that are Syrian, I can't be disconnected, but this is a reality, and this is Syria. If the FSA liberated a little village, next morning you see a peaceful demonstration. Till now, next morning you see a peaceful demonstration. The cartoons of Chernobyl is like 500 people or 800 people. The cartoons this guy learned during the revolution to draw, reaching the White House. It was shown in the White House in most European capitals and American capitals. And this is from my side.
First of all, thank you to our speakers. Now we have about half an hour to have a Q&A. But before we start, is there anything you want to bring up? Any more points or questions you want to address?
I'll just briefly add something. When we discuss the Syrian conflict, the Syrian civil war in particular, we have to appreciate there's so many layers to it, political layers, religious layers, and as my panelist mentioned, as a result of external and regional players using it as a playground for power battling, we have to appreciate there are so many layers, and it's emotional not only for Syrians, it's emotional for Sunnis and for Christians. So when we look at any war, but let's talk about Syria in particular, we have to be objective. Sometimes we can't help ourselves but get emotional, but we have to remain objective. And there are so many sides to the argument, there's so many theories, there's so many conspiracy theories. And regarding Syria, majority, if not all the media stations that report on it, have become the voice piece of their relevant government. Whether it's RT News, whether it's Press TV, whether it's Al Jazeera. As a journalist who's been specialised in the Middle East for 6 years plus, I'm relatively young, I'd like to think so. But every media station has its own agenda, and they're pushing whatever their donors and their financial benefactors are pushing. So no one can do justice to the Syrian civil war, or any war in that matter of fact. And the reality is, the facts of any war comes out later, years after, decades after. That's when secret documents and dossiers and whatnot are leaked out. I just wanted to add that.
Okay, so if there are any questions?
I have a question for Ghias.
Yeah.
I was wondering, one of the questions which came up when you were speaking, Dilwar, is who's buying the oil from ISIS, from the ISIS oil suppliers, apart from Turkey? So you said Turkey's buying.
The regime.
Turkey's buying. So
the Assad regime is buying. It's published by most of the international media and international agencies. The regime, they were having cash from the regime and bombing from petrol to Tartus city. The regime is buying from them, and
Turkey's buying from them.
Turkey is confirmed. Turkey is spoken about recently from the states, from the government, U.S. government and other government. They were buying. If it's not directly, indirectly. If it's
and sorry, follow-up question.
Yeah.
If this was to stop, would that basically be stopping ISIS?
No, I mean, I tell you something. I do believe in one thing. If you want to kill the snake, you have to kill its head. Yeah, the head of the snake is Assad regime. When Assad goes, things will change. Assad, the ISIS, Assad gave them a Raqqa city. In many areas in Idlib, Aleppo, the ISIS convoy went like 1 kilometer away from the regime. He is allowing them. I mean, you said about the so-called liberation of Mosul. The ISIS took their heavy arms from Mosul to Raqqa, 300 kilometers. They don't have planes to protect. And they could have, one helicopter could have chased them. There is no, in Syria, I do believe, there is no half solution anymore. Half solution is over. It's what I said to the foreign ministry here and other government to approach me. If you want to, Syria needs a solution. During the bombardment of the ISIS, I don't believe it's happening properly. Yesterday they captured in Homs city another oil field. Yesterday in Kobani, they've been there. They couldn't. The Americans said 4,888. I still remember the number. Raids on ISIS around Kobani, this little town, Kurdish city, and they still getting into it. You understand? It's like there must be a solution in Syria. They must finish off the regime and then finish ISIS. This is what I believe in. Otherwise, what I wanted to say, sorry, I forgot. Why they are bombing ISIS? The regime destroyed one area. It's called Jobar area in Damascus. Destroyed most of it, like crazy, in the last few days. The regime is bombarding the civilians strongly. Today, the foreign minister said, with Al-Akhbar newspaper in Lebanon, said we are benefiting from the ISIS bombardment. The head of the snake should go. Assad is the disaster in the country, and when he goes, the others will be dealt with easier.
I'd just like to answer your question as well. It's well documented, and ISIS have admitted it, and so has Bashar al-Assad, that the Syrian regime is buying oil from ISIS. Both parties have admitted to this. ISIS have said that, look, we need revenue, and we don't see anywhere in Islamic law that we cannot sell to the enemy. And obviously the Assad regime sees it as we need oil, cheap oil to run the country, so we will purchase oil whether it comes across as our enemy or not. I'm not sure about Turkey. But I'd like to add one thing. Regarding the Syrian civil war, there's 3 prevalent views or conspiracy theories, or however you want to term it. You've got the axes of resistance. For those of you who are not aware what axes of resistance is, that's basically Iran, Syria, Hezbollah of Lebanon, backed by Russia. This is
Hamas.
Hezbollah. Okay, we can leave Hamas out, but this is the axis of resistance. You can, yes, okay, you can include Hamas, but those are the 4 countries or powers that make up the axis of resistance. And their position is this, that the whole Syrian civil war from the onset was a Zionist plot planned by the US to weaken Syria. That's one position, which is quite prevalent. All you have to do is just tune into Press TV or RTN and you'll see it. Zionist-backed Syrian rebels and whatnot. The other narrative is the Muslim Brotherhood narrative. And that narrative is that, you know, Bashar al-Assad is a secular dictator, anti-Sunni, wants to preserve his Alawite sect. He doesn't want to allow Sunnis to come into power, and that's the Muslim Brotherhood narrative. And there's a third narrative, which my co-panelists would probably regard as the extremist Salafist narrative, but I disagree because the Salafist movement, this puritanical movement, is such a broad movement. You cannot pinpoint, yes, its origins is in Saudi Arabia, but you've got other Salafist groups within Syria that are fighting ISIS. You've got Salafist scholars in the UK that have condemned ISIS from the very onset. And the very nature of the Salafi minhaj, or the Salafist methodology, is that you do not rebel against the leader. This is actually a well-ingrained principle in Salafist ideology, that you do not rebel against the leader. So I'm sorry to just go off on a tangent. Yes, the regime is purchasing oil from ISIS and ISIS is selling. But there are 3 prevailing theories or positions regarding the Syrian war. It's the axis of resistance, it's the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's what I regard as the international Salafist pro-caliphate position. And this is that, you know, Syria is mentioned in the Quran and in numerous hadith to be, hadiths being the sayings and the actions of the Prophet Muhammad, that there will be a final war in this area called Bilad al-Sham. Bilad al-Sham, known as the Levant, is Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and there are many prophecies relating to this area. So many of these rebels are on the ground. They perceive themselves to be fulfilling this final battle between good and evil. So there are many conspiracy theories and positions regarding the Syrian civil war. Depending on where your political or religious or allegiances lie, you tend to believe what you want to believe. Obviously, as a journalist, you have to remain impartial and objective at all times.
Yeah, just thank you both for coming. I just want to tone out a bit and look at the bigger picture. You seem to both say that ISIS as a religious is a religious problem. ISIS and this religious intolerance is a political problem caused by old grievances from the invasion of 2003. But religious intolerance, as I'm sure everyone agrees, especially in Islam, goes back thousands of years. Is it not the case that the issue of ISIS is a religious one? If there was no religion, would we not realise that we all share the same humanitarian values and live peacefully together?
Would you like to answer that?
I'm not. I tell you something. I believe that the religious. I don't believe the ISIS came from the injustice caused by the invasion of Iraq. I don't believe at all. I believe you mentioned that clearly. The ISIS exploited the injustice to fill some of the vacuum created by the invasion. But I tell you something. This is my views. I hope I'm not offensive to anybody. All religions they have a high level of intolerance. All of them, including the Buddhists. The Buddhists itself killing Muslims in Burma. So it's not. Problem is now because the Middle East, it's in the front page again. We are talking about the Islam intolerance. The Christian invaded Jerusalem. The Crusaders killed people, raped, invaded everything. The problem is there is a problem with Islam from my point of view. It's captured, the religion is captured by the politics of bad players from my side, Saudi Arabia and Iran. This is why it's still there. It's why we cannot have a development within the revolution like the Christianity in Europe did. Like, okay, we translated the Bible, you want to go and pray, you pray, but leave politics out of the politics. And this is a problem. So many players responsible, including Britain. Creating Saudi Arabia is a terrible disaster in history. That's Saudi Arabia, the regime now. And the Islam has two sides from my living in Syria. A great tolerance, beautiful side where calls like any other religions for justice and love, and the intolerance which is on the surface now. And so
just to
different from that side as well.
Just to answer your question there, it's historically and factually incorrect to actually assume what you're saying. Christians and Jews lived in peace and security previously under numerous Islamic states. When the Spanish Inquisition happened, when Jews were run out of Europe, they seek refuge under the Ottoman Empire. However, ISIS's interpretation of an Islamic state, ISIS's interpretation of how religious minorities, and as we know it, people of the book, are treated under their state. Again, this comes down to their interpretation. As Ghias mentioned, you lived in Syria, Christians lived in peace with Muslims.
Super.
Yeah?
I knew my neighbors were Christian
Lived in
after when
peace.
I was 15. I never knew they were Christians.
Why is it that when Islam, we're going to have to touch upon a bit of his history here, it has to be, to answer your question. When the Islamic armies, Muslim armies, and the companions of the prophets came out of the Arabian Peninsula and they entered Egypt and Syria, if you look at even Christian historians, right, that in many cases there were no fights. Some cases there were, but in many cases there weren't. And Christians were allowed to have their churches. They were allowed to pray, they were allowed to do whatever they needed to do. And in fact, the jizya tax, which everyone's hyping about, this jizya tax, this tax for religious minorities, is actually significantly lesser than what a Muslim would have to pay. We have to appreciate that. So long as you can differentiate between ISIS's interpretation of Sharia law and how Sharia law was implemented previously in Islamic history, then hopefully that should address the issue. But one more thing. Christianity in Europe went through a period of enlightenment, right? It went through a period where the church and the state was separated. And there was a reason for this. There was a context to this because the Vatican had oppressed Europe for years. The King James Bible was the first English Bible after how many centuries of Christianity in Europe? Whereas Islam, the Quran was translated into numerous languages. So we have to appreciate, whilst it's quite easy to coin every religion. At the end, I'm a Muslim, so when you want to coin every religion under the same umbrella, you have to appreciate that Christianity in Europe had a very, very different history to Islam in the Middle East and North Africa. And it hasn't gone through a period of enlightenment, and it still hasn't, even though you've got secular movements and secular parties in the Muslim world, it still hasn't gone through a systematic process of enlightenment. If you ask me if it ever will do, I don't think it ever will.
Why do you think that is?
Because it's in the Prophet's history. The Prophet was a military leader, he was a politician, he was a father, he was a spiritual leader, he was an imam, he was what Muslims regard the perfect leader. And so I don't think that there will be a systematic process of enlightenment, the way it happened in Christianity. But that said, there are secular movements, there are movements calling for this enlightenment, but it has not taken place, and I personally don't think it will take place.
I think I tell you something, there were some attempts within the Middle East. There was few Egyptians who wrote, one Moroccan, Nasser Hamad Abu Zaid, for people who read, he did try to bring the Islam, he did try to bring Islam to its non-Wahhabi situation, and he was kicked out of Egypt, was forced, the Azhar divorced his wife, and Faraj Foda, he did fantastically publish few researches on the back to Quran and interpret the Quran within the modern context. He was killed, stabbed out of the mosque 5-6 times. Many scholars have tried to reform, and I believe the problem is why we don't have reform, because Islam is really captured by some political establishment like the Azhar, the Saudis, and other places, and there is the violence and threat about anybody who speak against what's happening. I mean, it reminds you of like the same lobby of Israel when you say I'm against the bombardment of Gaza and you say anti-Semitic, and it's what's happening in the Middle East for the last few decades, unfortunately. And I definitely believe what's happening now in the Arab Spring will move the discussion of Islam forward, because we cannot carry on like this. I mean, you cannot say I'm atheist in in Syria I wasn't able to say I'm atheist, but in Egypt you'll be cut off by a taxi driver if you say I'm atheist. So that's why when I go there I say to them I'm Christian, so they don't discuss with me. They say, oh, God bless you. But there is another problem I want to mention. With Islam there is the problem of fatwas. There is no a high council like a Vatican. Everybody can have a fatwa. And then because of this social media and so many satellites, if you do a fatwa, a woman, the latest fatwa, I tell you something. A Saudi imam said, a woman cannot sleep next to the wall because all is masculine. I mean, I just read it, and people have like 16, 17, 18,000 likes on Facebook. This is a chaos. But I believe the reform is coming and bring back the religion to really its spirit, like it's a religion, your relation between you and Allah.
Again, I will answer your question. I know you've had your hands up, but I just want to add something to this. It's quite frustrating to hear that any kind of political version of Islam, you immediately blame Saudi. I unanimously disagree with this, and the reason this is that all it takes is a simple Google wiki search into the classical scholars of Islam, historians, to say that politics is actually intertwined in Islamic theology and scripture. And this is why, when you have people who want to counter the jihadist narrative, that all it takes is a simple Google search into the Islamic literature to see that, you know what, the Prophet Muhammad did fight wars. And just on the subject of slave girls and slavery, slavery was a common international norm 1,000 years ago. It wasn't just exclusive to the Arabs or the Muslims. Christian armies had Christian slaves. Slavery was not something that was exclusive to the Muslim armies of the previous centuries. And I just wanted to add to that.
Yeah, we don't want to focus on that, but I was just saying that the Saudis, I'm speaking of the current, what's going on. Saudis are a big owner of the Islam now, unfortunately, and the Azhar. So we can, in the break, can speak about that if you want.
I'd like to respectively bring about a couple of points of information. Being the Ottoman Empire was not tolerant of its minorities. And in terms of Turkey's support for ISIS and similar states, such as the Saudis and the Qataris, these countries, especially Turkey being a NATO member, they have supported ISIS and similar organizations for the past 4 to 5 years in the region, with military camps, with other provisions, with weapons. And this is open to the West, and it's no secret. People have been following this for years. And so why is it that the Western media hasn't concentrated on Turkey, and why is it that the West is still allowing Turkey to have a voice on such platforms as NATO? Is it not wrong to allow such an ideology or a government which is in line with ISIS to be able to speak in a platform of states of states and a collection of states which we deem to be liberal? That's my question for you two as journalists. Other than that, Islam and other religions, in my opinion, people use religion to get what they want through power politics, and they've used it for the past 2,000 years in the same region, and it's been the reason for many wars for many uprisings, for many massacres and genocides. And I think it's just a continuation. I know Muslims who are moderate and peaceful, and I know Muslims who support ISIS. It's just people using an apparatus of religion or any other ideology to get what they want.
Can I go first? Okay.
Please.
I mean, on the way to here, after I prayed, you told me yourself that the Ottoman Empire was very tolerant towards Jews and Christians, right?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. But obviously it selected certain minorities which it wanted to force assimilation.
The largest minority being the Alevi ones within its own country.
Yeah. But we were in agreement that it did protect the Jews and Christians who went to the Ottoman state seeking refuge from Christian Europe.
I mean, they protect. I'm from Syria. I am from the Alawite area. They protected.
It's well documented.
The Ottomans protected when they wanted to protect. They massacred the Alawite. They massacred the Christians in the coastal areas of Syria, and they did too many massacres. They did kill the Sunnis as well when they started.
Between minorities like the ones oppressed is not an example. It's like cherry picking examples of protecting minorities.
No one ever claimed that any of the Islamic states was a utopian state. None of these states are utopian. But anyway, look, regarding Turkey, right? Turkey is the US's foreign policy arm in the region, right? It's a US agent, it's a US stooge, right? I'm going to be very frank with you, right? Personally, I do not seek the approval or certain standards of the US and even our own government to tell us regarding what human rights are, to tell us what's right and wrong is, right? That's the second thing. Why it's being underreported, I don't know why. Maybe because there is a wider agenda regarding the Syrian conflict, and Turkey is very well involved in this, and we know that many of the British jihadis got to Syria and joined ISIS through the Turkish borders. We are fully aware of this, right? Thirdly, regarding religion and war, right? The 20th century, from the World War I to 1994, 87.5 million people have died from wars waged by secular states who were run by secular ideologies. 87.5 million people. Please go research that. The number which would have surpassed 100 million now. Right? I just want to say that. So it's a misconception, you know, religion is the cause of wars, and you know, yeah, of course there was. Of course, I don't deny that. The Crusades and there were numerous other instances. But in the modern era, 20th century, right? In an era where we talk about freedom and humanity and tolerance, 87.5 million people have died from the First World War to 1994 by secular states for secular reasons, for geopolitics and for natural resources. I just wanted to make that note. But again, regarding Turkey, my friend, yes, it is underreported, but it is well known. It is well known that many of these fighters that are coming from the West especially are entering Turkey, entering Syria via Turkey. But I'd also like to note that, look, there's biker gangs from Germany and Holland that are entering Syria. There are Shias that are leaving Europe and entering Syria. It's very messy, and the reporting is very selective, again, depending on which news channel or news outlet you're choosing to read and follow.
Can I tell you something very briefly about Turkey? I learned from the Syrian crisis, the Syrian pain, I call it. I don't have anything to do with the West. I can't blame the West. I mean, the terrible events in Syria is a homemade in the beginning. The regime is Syrian. The pilots who are dropping explosive barrels are Syrians. The West is seeking their interest. Why don't we seek our interest? Why somebody like back to Qatar or something put like billions of dollars on project supporting Islamic groups in Libya and Tunis instead of paying this money to develop the region? I really learned, I don't want to blame the West. When you open your door, the thieves come in. And the West, they are interested in petrol, business, and blah, blah, blah. Why we are not interested? The Middle East is the richest place on the planet, and I'm not saying here, the Syrians keep saying, oh, the West didn't come and save us. Syrians are entertaining, some of Syrians entertaining each other by killing the other. and we should sort our what's called rubbish, let's say, I don't know, locally.
I mean, just to add before I take another question, I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
Look, you know, it's very, no one's blaming the West or anything here, but I'm just asking the audience.
Not you. I'm speaking to the Syrians that are blaming the West.
I just like, there were some Syrians, respectfully, are saying, look, you didn't intervene, you didn't help us. Whereas others are saying, we don't need your help. Right? But look, history is usually written by the victor. However, the reality of the Sykes-Picot is no secret. The secret of Balfour Declaration is no secret. And for those of you who don't know who the Sykes-Picot, the Politics of International Relations, you should know what it is basically when Britain and France carved up what was known as the Ottoman Empire between themselves, with a ruler, yeah, and a shandy in the other hand, right? And this is no lie, this is fact. And you have to appreciate, to understand the present and to plan for the future, you have to look back at the past. This is cause and effect. This is standard. This is a standard procedure. And when we talk about World War I, we're not talking about thousands of years ago. We're only talking less than 100 years ago, right? So I'm not asking you all to think back and look back at the Crusade. I'm talking about just look back 100 years ago, that the divide and rule policy of the Muslim world, which was carried out by Britain and France, namely, has still affects the Muslim world till now. For those of you from South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, we still have a very racist caste system, right? And this was left and exploited when the British Raj was there, and the East India Trade Company. So I'm not blaming the West. I receive and gain nothing from blaming the West. I'm a British citizen, I was born here. I support Liverpool Football Club, I watch EastEnders. I'm as British as you guys here. But what I'm saying is to look back at historical facts and how it's shaped the modern day and how we're going to address the issue of the Middle East.
Yeah, this directed to you. Do you think that media itself is a kind of recruitment tool for associations like ISIS? Because you get people like CNN and Fox News reporting that Islam is a problem, and then you get people, not to be rude, but like yourself, saying that would the world be better if Islam was gone? And then you get cherry-picked statistics like 16 to 18,000 people like this Facebook page that women can't sleep next to walls. So you have this divide, and you think that makes Muslims feel like they are alienated, and we are social beings, so we want to fit in somewhere. So if not here, then it will be there.
As a journalist, right, when I did my NCTJ in newspaper journalism, the first thing that they told me, the fundamental pillars of journalism was accountability, impartiality, and to educate and inform. Till this day, I do not believe in any news being impartial. I just don't believe it. Yeah, I don't believe that any news can be impartial. Because ultimately, no matter how much you try being fair, you have a leniency towards one group. Whether it's political, ideological, or whatever it is, you have a leniency and a tendency towards one way of thinking, right? So I don't believe in impartial news, right? Secondly, there is a huge campaign, right? Whether it's systematic, whether it's organized, whether it's orchestrated, I'm not fully aware. But there is, since post 9/11, a serious demonization of Islam in the media, right? And an example of this is when you have a successful Muslim sportsman, academic, politician, he's British. But whenever there's a criminal who commits a crime, he's a Muslim, right? So yes, there is an element of Islamophobia in the mainstream media. But Muslims will be like the Muslims, like our forefathers and ancestors previously. That we moved, we travelled like every other human social beings, and we settled in places, and we adopted the culture, we adopted the rules and the legislation. Many times we did not contradict our own religious laws. We assimilated and we integrated like any other social religious group. But in this current climate, in Britain, this is a whole different subject, and I'm giving a lecture next week in SOAS on the criminalization of Islam in the West. That's basically a whole different topic in itself, and that was obviously
fanned after 9/11, 7/7, Woolwich. But Muslims living in Britain have a duty to convey the real message of Islam to their fellow students, to their work colleagues, to their neighbours. They have a duty, right, to convey the correct message. That's my advice I can give you.
Yeah, I'm not saying that will Muslims convey the right message. I'm saying with people watching the mainstream Western networks like CNN and Fox News, they believe that Islam is to blame, and will that push Muslims, whether they're right or wrong, to the brink of alienation and towards ISIS?
Well, there could be an element of that. Again, that can't be statistically proven. We don't actually know that. But if the media will, whether it's the Western, whether it's Fox News or BBC, if it continues bashing ISIS, and that isolates Muslims to now start sympathising with ISIS, maybe. But I still reckon, I don't think that can be substantiated. I think that if the mainstream media in the West especially continues to depict ISIS and continues blaming ISIS's crimes as a fault in Islam, then there will be a serious issue of isolation and alienation, because how the Muslims will feel is that here we are, the majority, and we have unequivocally rejected this, condemned this, yet our religion is still being blamed. Yeah? So, do I feel that will there be isolation? Yes. Do I feel that that will lead them to sympathizing with ISIS? I can't say. I don't think that can be substantiated.
Alright, thank you.
No.
Yeah, I want to elaborate on a point you made before. European citizens joining, fighting in Syria. Would you say this is more of a religious consequence, or is this are these just people who are actually just really want to join the fighting against the regime? And the next thing is there is also this growing notion that these people are being treated as criminals, and obviously, for instance, in Germany, I think 4,000 people, even more, joined the fighting in Syria. There's this notion of disenfranchising them and also taking their citizenship away.
Are you talking about the Muslim fighters or the fighters that are going to join the
yeah, they actually joined both the ISIS and the FSA. Okay. So, or are these people that just want to fight? Because we've seen cases like that being run out in the Ukraine. So, this is basically a question to both of you. If you have any opinion on that.
I really don't have in-depth information about that, but I do believe there is a religious context in that. I mean, mainly because they are far away from the reality, and they listen to some news that the ISIS is declaring the caliphate. I mean, Dilwar said it's a dream of many Muslims to have an Islamic state, and some of them are having also frustration in this country or in the West in general. They can't get, I mean, in England, Britain is relatively good, but if you go to Belgium or Holland, there is a really nasty open campaign against Muslims. And listen to the right-wingers who are nearly half of the parliament in Holland against the Moroccans or the Muslims. It's terrifying. Till the British government banned one of the MPs last time. Scott Fielders, to enter the country, even he's a European citizen. There is a mixture of religious context, frustration, and also irresponsible imams. I mean, look, when I came here, never been to a mosque, maybe in my life, except when I was little, but I went to this Finsbury Park, Abu Hamza, the Hukman. But he wasn't in the mosque. I was passing by with somebody and I heard him talking. I was 2 weeks in England and I was terrified, mainly because I came from a very then tolerant society in Syria. I was, terrified. And these people are frustrated. Mainly some of the Muslims born here are mad. You can talk about that more than me because you're born here. But because they are frustrated about what their families went through. I mean, like you, maybe your dad has or had a shop or whatever, but now this new generation can learn. You are a journalist. I met the other day Abbas Khan is this from Muslim. He's a great human doctor. And you know, this mixture of frustration and religious, and I put the religious context because these guys are really far from reality. They do read some media and they think it's really the ISIS is really implementing what Prophet Muhammad said. Yeah.
I'm glad you asked that question, but look, for those of you, you can go online, right? And I recently interviewed a fighter from Birmingham, and whilst my name is Dilwar Hussein, I'm commonly known as Dilwar Hussein. And you can check my Huffington Post blogs out, and the interview that I recently did with a fighter who's currently in Syria, in Birmingham land, educated. And I frankly asked him, what did you leave for? What was your main reason for leaving? Because we're under the perception that, you know, Muslims are being radicalized online, and, you know, they're seeing guns and macho-ness, and that's the reason why they're leaving. I think that the main reason why they've left is that they've seen non-stop wreckage, pillage, bloodshed, violence on television, on social media, and they just wanted to go and help. And I asked him, what was your main reason for going to Syria? Because I just wanted to go and help the oppressed Muslims. Yeah? That's the first reason. Second reason, he went, well, at the same time, if I can help establish an Islamic State, I will do so. My first reason was to go and help the oppressed Syrians. I was saying to my friend here, on the way to driving to Oxford, I said, I hope it doesn't get to this stage where I have to tell them about my wife's second cousin who died in Syria, fighting with ISIS. His name's Iftikhar Jaman. You can Google him. And there was, I'm sure those of you follow news, there were a group of 6 lads that went from Portsmouth to Syria to join ISIS. These guys were educated, they had good jobs, came from good families, right? And when they left the letters for their parents, and when they left some kind of communication, whether it was emails, they never ever said that we were going there for blood and killing, and you know, we want to kill Shias and we want to kill Alawites, and we just want to go and help the oppressed Sunnis of Syria. However, once many of them arrived there and they realized what was actually happening, when they actually realized that, whoa, we're not actually fighting the regime here, we're fighting other Syrian rebels, we're fighting the Free Syrian Army, we're fighting Jabhat al-Nusra, we're fighting Ahrar al-Sham, we're fighting all these different other Sunni rebels. This is not what I signed up for, right? And the second question that you asked, now they feel they're numbered. We come back, we get arrested, our passports are confiscated, our citizenship is revoked, right? As Theresa May mentioned a few months back, right? So now there's a situation where we have a minority of disillusioned fighters in Syria that are worried to come back, even if they wanted to come back. Some of them majority of them seek martyrdom, so they want to die out there. But those who want to come back, they're not able to. And the case that I put forward to you is that when British Jews go and join the IDF, the Israeli army, and they carry out what many would perceive as war crimes against the Gazans, or when Brits left previously for the Spanish Civil War, and they returned, they were hailed as victors and heroes, right? And remember, these young fighters that left Britain to fight Bashar al-Assad, they were only following up the same rhetoric that Western governments were saying, that was to remove Bashar al-Assad, but they did nothing. So to answer your question, is there a religious reason? Yes, they feel that there's a religious duty to go and help the oppressed. Why is it that they chose Syria specifically as opposed to other areas, other wars? Like I said, there's many prophecies and sayings of the Prophet, I mentioned in the Quran about the exclusiveness of Bilad al-Sham, which is Syria. The issue of revoking citizenship and rendering them stateless is a case that many would have to take up with the European Court of Human Rights, and that's another whole area in itself.
We see claims being made of British Muslims going over to Syria and Iraq, and the fact that they might come back radicalised. Would you agree with that? And would you also agree that even though the Muslims who would like to go out and help for the sake of humanitarian purposes are prevented from doing so because of this false perception or this false claim we have of them coming back radicalised?
But look, we're approaching the 4th year of the Syrian civil war, and approximately, I don't know how accurate this number is. Like, when the MI5 says something, I take it as a pinch of salt. But they basically estimate as 500 British Muslims have gone to join ISIS. Apparently 200 are already back, right? We're entering the 4th year of the Syrian civil war. There's not been a single terrorist attack in Britain. Okay. Thank God. However, my worst nightmare was this. That if the West, namely, forget the West, if Britain decided to put boots on the ground in Iraq, which they are currently considering, and they're already carrying out airstrikes in Iraq, then there could be a slight possibility of a blowback here in the UK. Because when the 7/7 happened, and you see the video of Mohammed Sadiq, the 7/7 bomber, or Michael Adebolajo in Woolwich, there's a strong emphasis on foreign policy. And I just wish that our government and our leaders would understand that there is a clear link between military intervention and a blowback at home. As one Guardian blogger said, it's literally a case of leave us alone and we leave you alone. You hit us, we hit you back. It's as simple as that. It may not be the cure to all the problems, and it may not be the solution to all domestic national security threats, but I do believe that this will tackle it. Do I believe that these fighters coming back, radicalised, will carry out terrorist attacks? No, I don't, because we would have seen one by now, right? We're entering the 4th year, right? But now that there are British tornado jets carrying out airstrikes against ISIS, who knows if there are any sympathisers that come back and carry out attacks. Lone wolf attacks is something else. What happened in Ottawa, what happened in Woolwich, these are lone wolf attacks. These are unrelated, unlinked to any kind of international jihadist movement. So the answer to your question is, do I think that there will be any kind of attacks? No. Will genuine human rights activists and charity aid workers, will they be criminalised and targeted for this? Of course, this is already happening. This is already happening. A friend of mine is called Majid Freeman, a very prominent aid worker. He was stopped at the airport 3 times. Currently his passport has been confiscated, and this guy's just an aid worker. Just an aid worker who takes medicine and clothes with a registered charity. But then again, Muslim charities linked to Syria are also under light. So I hope that answers your question.
Can we have time for one more question, if anybody wants? If not,
cool. Do you think that a post-Bashar al-Assad Syria would be much worse, and that the will of the Syrian people is to keep him in power? Because I don't think if the Syrian people really opposed him, he would stay on for 4 years. And even because for me personally, I'm not really pro-democracy in the Middle East. I'm originally from Turkey, and Ataturk, the founding father, dictator, did a much better job than any elected leader. So do you think a post-Bashar al-Assad Syria, though he's a dictator, though he has committed human rights atrocities, Syria would be better off than, for example, an elected government?
I'll let the Syrian answer that.
I don't think so. Of course, Assad Syria would be 100% better. We will, as I said before, we will have a transitional, painful period. But if you've lived in Syria and you've seen what Assad did, you would have changed your mind. I mean, Ataturk was a dictator, but he had a plan, like Bourguiba in Tunisia. He wanted to change the society, mix people together and make one people, and Bourguiba in Tunisia succeeded to some extent. Ataturk maybe, yes. But look, dictators, especially in the Middle East, they never build their glory on serving people. I'm not elected, but I'm serving you. I mean, Assad dealt with Syria as one thing, as a farm. It was his farm. Look at this, his cousin. It's what triggered the Syrian events. His cousin, called Rami Makhlouf. I'm sure you know about him.
Yes, sir.
He was 32 when Bashar took over. Normal engineer. Of course, I'm sure his father stole a few thousand, $100,000. When he was 33, he bought, his money was 600 million. He bought one of the most beautiful historical things in Damascus called Damascus International Exhibition. He bought it for 99 liras, which is that time $1.5, and next week sold it to Qatar They were like friends that time for a billion. Nobody could do any business, anything in the country. I interviewed a Syrian businessman who fled to Canada. This man, his father, have you been to Damascus?
I haven't.
This historical souk in Damascus called Hamidiyya souk. You know, it's like bazaar. Beautiful. 3,000-4,000 years old, I don't know. And this man, his father started a little shop. I mean, his great-grandfather. Then his great-grandfather expanded. His father made it a big, so they became rich by that time. Rami Makhlouf came and said to him, I need half of it. And this man said, look, I wasn't fast-track rich man. All my family and sisters were. In 2 weeks' time, and I say in 2 weeks, in 14 days, he gave him 14 days notice. He confiscated everything, and he came to arrest him. By that time, he fled to Beirut, luckily enough, thanks to Sykes-Picot, we have Lebanon. We have Lebanon, so people can flee to Lebanon after, thanks to George Bush, kicked the Syrian army out of it. Now we say that. And he fled to Beirut, confiscated 100% of his wealth, and arrested his cousin relatives. And they are, I don't know what happened now, but when the Syrian revolution started, they were still disappeared. This man dealt with Syria as a farm, 17 apparatus, secret services, and they all hate each other. In Syria, I myself been arrested once by the state security services. Suspected I'm writing with a pseudonym, with a different name. Arrested me 1 week, released me. On Friday evening I was released because I didn't confess. On Saturday morning, like 6 hours something, the military intelligence came and arrested me for the same reason. I promise you this is a real story. Released by the military services after 2 days, the political services. I went for 5 arrests for the same reason. You know, everybody wants to do the glory, present the present to Assad. I'm loyal. I nearly what's words. I can mess up this country for your sake and you stay in power. Dictators never work, especially in the Middle East. Never work.
So hasn't democracy. Name me one successful democracy in the Middle East.
I'm very glad you raised that point.
But I tell you something. Sorry, I just take over. Democracy doesn't come. Tunisia. I've been an election observer last week with the Carter Center in Tunisia. Tunisia is on the right track. Tunisia on the right. 100% transparent elections took place on the 26th of October. But Middle East has never had any chance. I mean, democracy needs education. We need education. We need either education or some Ataturk to come for a few years. But
even Ataturk can do that.
Yeah, but
let me just quickly touch upon something what you said. Yeah, I'm very glad you raised that point. There's not a single successful democracy in the Muslim world, but I think the Muslim world, the Arab world, perceives and defines democracy in a very, very, very different way to how it's perceived or manifested or practiced in the West. That's the first thing. Secondly, we have had dictators in the Muslim world. We've had Gamal Abdul Nasser, Hafiz al-Assad and his son Bashar al-Assad, Mubarak, Ben Ali, Gaddafi, numerous tyrants, right? But these guys claim to be pseudo-democrats. They claim to be pseudo-secular democracies, but in fact they were brutal dictators. If you're asking me, does the Muslim or Arab world require a strong leader? Yes. Does it require a dictatorship? No. And the two are different, but there are elements of a strong leadership in dictators, but dictators ultimately are tyrannical. And there will always be an element of discontentment over the people that they rule. But does the Arab Muslim world need a strong leader? What some may perceive as a dictator? Yes. Is there a single successful democracy, not even in the Arab world, in the Muslim world? No, there isn't. And that's just frank, and that's fact. So I'm glad you raised that point.
Syria had the best elections in 1954.
Was this when they joined with Egypt as a country?
No, that was it. That was a disaster.
Yeah,
that was a disaster.
1954.
8 years after the French left Syria, Syria had transparent elections. 40% of women ran to the parliament. It's very famous, and the West, that time the Western media said it was a European standard. Syria was going into a beautiful track in the 50s. Still, the military took over, and Abdel Nasser came in the 58 to occupy Syria in the name of Arab unification. And I tell you something, it's the last thing I would say. People in the Middle East are desperate for democracy. We are desperate for democracy, but it needs education. I saw it in my eyes last week in Tunisia. From people from 95-year-old, I spotted 2 persons in one of the polling center. 95, they were 95, hardly seen, hardly hearing, carried by 2 assistants, and they came and voted. And they did, they have ink in Tunisia that I voted. And they went and started saying and praying and thanking God that I lived to that day. And I had to keep a high level of professionality. But I tell you something, I nearly cried when I saw it. I mean, people oppressed, they need somebody to let you live your life, of course, with rules and like any other countries. But Middle East needs dictators. Middle East needs the opposite. We need to start have civil societies in the countries.
As concluding comments, right? If by democracy you mean, or if by democracy my co-panelist means that a transparent government, and a government which you can freely account, and a government which can provide the basic necessities to its citizens, then
corruption.
And no corruption, then yes. But again, we can't fool ourselves to think that there is such a thing as a utopian state. I think the Arab world, and the Muslim world, generally speaking, has faced so much oppression and tyranny and bloodshed that even if you threw democracy at them, they wouldn't even know how to define it or what to do with it. Right? So I agree with you that is it a successful democracy right now? No. Does the Arab Muslim world require a strong leader, which some may call a dictatorship? Yes. But does the Muslim Arab world need a dictator or dictatorship? Hell no. No. We've had many dictators. And that's not what we're going to.
Remember Tunisia 4 years.
We'll save the Islamic Party once now.
Sorry?
The Islamic Party.
Another. And another started playing politics there, which is good. Congratulated the opponent.
But
Tolerance is as much of a democratic principle as elections are. And so if we have elections, does it mean that backwards people are going to come to power and take away rights and liberties? Tolerance and rights and liberties are a principle of democracy as elections. Hopefully you are.
Education. We need in the region to be 2 things. Education and to be left alone. That's
yes, to be left alone.
Yeah, that's
And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you for coming, and a big thank you to our guests. It's been really quite enlightening.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
I know that.
We will have other events going on later on in the semester, and hopefully next semester as well. So keep an eye out on our Facebook page. Thank you.